Welcome back, everyone, and I hope you've had a nice break and that you're ready to dive into another fruitful session on national housing strategies. I think you'll agree the presentations and discussions so far have been informative and really, really fabulous. And please keep your comments and your questions coming. You'll see the chat and the question buttons on your screen. And please do live post on social media if you do feel inclined, whether it's Twitter, LinkedIn or Instagram. And those hashtags again are hashtag Housing Assembly 2021, hashtag affordable housing and hashtag social value of housing. And we're going to be doing something a little bit different in this session. We're going to have our graphic illustrator Zara on board this time around, and she'll be capturing the discussion as it goes, and as the session unfolds, so too will her illustration. So keep an eye out for that. I would like now to welcome Dr. Katrina Rayner, postdoctoral research fellow and convener of the Hallmark Research Initiative for Affordable Housing. She's introducing this next session before handing over to Professor Michele Acuto to convene the discussion. Thanks, Katrina.
Thank you, Karen. And hello, everyone. Just a quick note from me as one of the co-curators of this symposium. It's been a wonderful morning so far. We started today with a presentation from Ben Rimmer, CEO of Homes Victoria, on the local impact of the big housing build on this state. And this was followed by a presentation from Professor Saskia Sassen, who took us on a whirlwind tour of global cities and housing markets. So from the local to the global, we now turn our attention to arguably, in my opinion, the most important scale of governance for affordable housing and housing affordability policy. It's particularly insightful to be convening a panel with perspectives from Canada, the Asia-Pacific region, and Australia because, as the presentations will no doubt highlight, there are many overlaps between these regions and also great scope for mutual learning. While Canada has recently delivered its first national housing strategy, Australia's federal government continues to avoid stepping into this policy void despite decades of advocacy on this topic. And while we often look to cities like Sydney, London, and New York as markets with the most unaffordable housing in the world, Kwan has shown how developing Asian cities are on par, even more unaffordable than these places, with policy and intervention options that we have much to learn from. As we continue our thinking on the social value of housing, it's important to consider the unspoken values that sit behind government policy decisions, or a lack of policy in the first place. While much of this symposium will consider the social value of specific projects, this session provides background to the potential social value that could emerge from large-scale housing interventions, or to use Saskia Sassen's words from earlier, the negative implications of brutal housing and policy decisions. So I now hand over to Professor Michele Acuto, Director of the Melbourne Centre for Cities, to host this session. Thank you, Michele.
Thanks, Kate. And thanks everyone for tuning in again, or for tuning in first in this. And I'll dive straight in because we've got a pretty packed panel and a pretty exciting session as per Kate's comments. I think this is sort of a terrific way to take a broad global look into sort of our national challenges and hear for some experiences. So what I'll do is introduce our panel first, and then we'll go through a whole set of questions. As per the previous session, do feel free to put questions in the question function for the symposium, and I'll try to direct them to panelists themselves, playing a bit of traffic cop. So from that perspective, I would like to introduce you to our three panelists today. So we're going to go first to Sydney, Professor Hal Pawson, who's Professor of Housing Research and Policy in the City Futures Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. Then we'll take a respectable plane allowed now detour to Singapore to Kwan Lee, who's Dean's Chair, Associate Professor of Urban Planning in the NUS Business School at the National University of Singapore, and then a big trip across the Pacific with big thanks for the late one to catch up with David Hulchanski, who's, and I'll try to pronounce this correctly, Dr. Chow Ching Chair in Housing and Professor of Housing and Community Development in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto. So needless to say, a very international panel, a very intentional international conversation, and a very exciting next hour of debate. I'll dive straight in, and we're going to try and cover quite a bit of ground, and we decided to sort of start from a bit of a broader framing on the question of affordable housing. We're quite interested on what key factors our panelists are seeing at the moment driving housing and affordability from the perspective of their researchers. So if you wouldn't mind, Kwan, I'll throw this one first to you. What are the key factors driving housing and affordability in your view?
There are many reasons for housing affordability crisis, but the most obvious one that we can think of is that housing demand has increased more rapidly than housing supply in a given city. Let's first talk about the demand side. Where do we have now higher housing demand in certain cities than before? I and my co-author, George Galster, found the higher demand for high urban amenities among millennials. They want to commute for a shorter distance and live near cafes and restaurants. And this phenomenon has been coupled with the globalization, which drove actual migration and investment demand to popular global cities around the world, including Melbourne, where you are. In these cities, higher income households speed up the housing prices and crowd out lower income households. Even climate change could be a factor in this context of globalization. One of my colleagues at NUS has done research on how pollution in Beijing affects people's Google search behaviors and found they do more search for terms like immigration to New Zealand, air quality in Australia. And now we know how this Chinese investment has increased the housing prices in many cities around the world. On top of this simple increase in demand, we have experienced serious income inequality during the last decades. Because of uneven financial capacity to pay for housing costs, some households are likely to suffer even higher housing unaffordability. If no helps are offered to these households, they are simply unable to afford any housing in a given city. Now, what about the supply side? Restrictive land use regulations have been a core issue in many developed countries, including the US and UK, and I think Australia to some extent. Lot size, gross plot ratio requirements limit the housing density and the elasticity of housing supply in popular locations. Sometimes inefficient planning system slows down the redevelopment process and delays housing supply to the market, which happens a lot in South Korea and Taiwan, as well as in developing Asia. At the same time, uneven living environment between different neighborhoods within a city could create huge variation in housing prices and affordability problems because of the majority of households would have higher demand in better neighborhoods. For example, if transportation accessibility is only good in urban centers in one city, and neighborhoods that are a bit far away have to bear severe traffic congestion, housing demand would concentrate in urban areas, urban centers, and many households living there would experience housing unaffordability. And this is what we have found in many cities in developing Asia, including Manila, Philippines. I'll stop here, and I want to listen to what other panelists say. Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks, Kwan. I'm going to throw this to Hal next, if it's okay with you, David. So we can then carry on with David next. Is that okay? Hal, all yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michele. Yeah, thanks, Kwan, as well. I certainly pick up a lot of the points that you're making there and wouldn't disagree with them. But I think we need to ask the question of if we're talking about demand surging in a way that supply isn't able to keep up, we also have to talk about, or have to think about why that is. And I think you can't get away from the impact of the sort of tidal wave of cheap money. That is making it easy, making it possible to take out more and more, has made it possible over the last 20 years to take out greater and greater amounts of debt. And and it's also connected with the way that housing has changed in its function in the global economy and in many individual countries, that it's become far more importantly, or it's become viewed as an investment good. And attracting enormous amounts of demand for that purpose, more than as a good for its utility. So I think that's certainly been a massive factor in Australia, and I think in most other countries as well. And we have a set of tax settings in particular, and other policy settings that are very out of date, that just aren't set up for that world. In Australia, we haven't had a major change to our housing tax settings since the 1990s, and we're living in a very different world. 20 or 25 years after the last of those important settings were put in place. So we do need to update, and that could be a way of at least containing the problem here.
Nodding, whether that's terrifying or not is the question. What do you think, David?
Yeah, key factors. I think there are two that capture what we just heard. And this won't be news, but first off, we always have to keep in mind income and wealth inequality. From World War II until the late 80s, more or less, certainly Western nations were becoming slightly more equal. And then we turn that around. And then the wealth inequality is just huge. And so that's where you get these, all the cheap money and people looking for more investment goods. So income and wealth inequality. And then second is the problem with the housing system itself, right? The rules of the game. Each state, each nation, province has its, the way it operates, its mortgage system, its real estate agents, how they do their thing and all that. All these rules of the game set up who gets what housing at what price. And since the 1990s, especially what we call neoliberalism, leaving things to the market, we've changed regulations in favor of investors, in favor of people who are already in the housing market, already have some good income and some good wealth. And we have a few decades of this happening. So we have to ask, what's the purpose of a housing system? Well, every politician will say it's to adequately house everyone. But in reality, we look around and it's a system for making some people even wealthier and contributing to even greater inequality in the nation itself. So then, in summary, what should a good housing system do? I think it should do three things. One is produce enough supply, a new and rehab old housing. We're generally doing that, although there's complaints about it that are partly political in my view. Secondly, the housing system has to produce choice, a mix of tenure, a mix of location sizes, addressing different needs, right? And then third, it needs to assist those who aren't able to afford what is available, adequate and appropriate housing. We're generally doing number one fairly well, and not number two too well, and then three not very well at all. And certainly I can speak for Anglo-American countries that I know quite well.
Thanks, David. Let me pick you up on that. And so let's go to those politicians. So I guess sort of our next overall panel question is national policy means the rest. And thinks that the interest there, obviously, David, was that Canada itself, in the delivery of its first national housing strategy, seems, at least from afar in the media, they have been heralded as sort of as a game-changing first step. So what did it take to get to that? And is it game-changing, or what are its challenges?
Yeah, good. We have a document in Canada called the National Housing Strategy. Yes. So you have to be careful what you ask for. So it's in the early 1990s. The Liberal Party of Canada is the middle of the road party. It campaigns as progressive, but it rules as conservative. And so in the 1990s, they ended our social housing supply program. So for 30 years until 1995, we were building about 20,000 social housing units a year. And that's how we got 4 percent of our national housing stock as non-market social housing. But then, neoliberal policies, austerity cutbacks, we're not going to do that anymore. And the federal government got out. So many of us began campaigning for a return to having a national engagement in housing policy. And we said, we want a national housing strategy. Okay. And for a couple of decades, we said that. Okay. And then comes the 2015 election that the Liberals were not expected to win. So they promised all kinds of things. This is Justin Trudeau then as the new leader at the time. But they won. So they were stuck with keeping some of their promises and dumping some of them. They promised proportional representation, which we don't have. And they dumped that and all that. But they came up with a document called a National Housing Strategy. And as we have time to discuss it further, there's some good things in there, but it's more of a media strategy of pretending they're doing a great deal, because the real dollars, the real expenditures are not changing. Now, COVID changed things a bit, but the National Housing Strategy would keep spending levels at the same level. There's no social housing program in the National Housing Strategy. There are no background studies. It's a clever 40-page document. You should look at it, and you'll be confused because it talks about all kinds of things and all that. So anyways, Canada still needs a national housing strategy. We have pieces of it there. And I'm assuming Hal will be talking about Australia's experience in the early 90s, which I followed and at the time even. And the end report of the Australia's national housing strategy was this agenda for action. I just looked at it again. It's 166 pages. It lays out specific policies, specific actions to implement those policies, and then targets for each year and some numbers, something quite real. And that's not in our national housing strategy, a 40-page document with lots of pretty pictures. The Australian effort was backed up with 15 background papers, 12 research monographs. There's a long list of those consultants' reports. We don't have any of that, okay? So indeed, nations, I think, should have a national housing strategy, something like what Australia had before government changed in that period. And we in Canada are still working towards that. But we do have a base, and I can say some more positive things about it as we proceed.
I think it's a perfect segue into how. So why haven't we had said document for 25 years, and why is that? What is that doing in Australia? How?
Yeah, thanks very much, David. That is all. There's a lot of incredibly valuable parallels there in the way that what you've described, and because the setup is so similar in Canada with the levels of government. I mean, I think, in fact, I'm not sure that you're right, though, that we actually had a national housing strategy in the flesh, if you want, in the 1990s. Yes, you're absolutely right. There was a massive preparatory effort to create one. And in fact, that preparatory effort was called the National Housing Strategy, but actually it didn't produce a document that was a way forward. It did all the groundwork, or it did a huge amount of groundwork that you've looked at, that you've rediscovered, which is actually not many people are aware of it now. It's very, very hidden in the Australia's housing policy history. I think, in reality, there hasn't been a national housing strategy in Australia, not for 25 years, more like 75. I mean, the last thing that you could call that a national housing strategy of any kind really was what we got at the end of World War II, which created the sort of architecture, some of which still exists today, around a shared responsibility for housing between the Commonwealth, or the federal level of government, and the states and territories. So, I mean, I think that the official reason, if you ask the federal government, well, why aren't you? Isn't this a problem, and isn't this an important topic? And why do you not have a housing strategy? The official answer is, it's not our business. The official answer is, read the Constitution. It doesn't mention housing when it as a Commonwealth or a federal responsibility. It's something the states and territories do. They're responsible for delivering housing. Yes, true, delivering, but not for actually the policy. Housing is a complex topic, and it's one where, in fact, the key policy levers are not predominantly held by states and territories, even if they have the delivery responsibility. And so really the reality is that tax settings, social security, immigration, those are all policies which are controlled at the federal level, and therefore can't, what the states and territories might want to operate in the housing sphere, they don't have very many of the powers that would enable them to do that. And broader than that, you've got a national level of government which is far outweighs the states and territories in its financial firepower, in what it can do, its tax powers to raise money, to borrow money, to issue currency. So for all of those reasons, it's really it's a kind of ignorant and narrow-minded to pretend that the national housing, that the national level of government doesn't have any business in this area. It does, and it often calls it something else, but actually it's the one where which holds the most important powers. So I mean, I think so there are some very there are a couple of examples I could give of how important it is to the national level of government. One is the very narrow example that if we go on the way we are going, with home ownership rates falling, not just for younger people, but right through the whole age spectrum, and beginning to fall in the retirement age group as well. If that continues, which is projected to do at the moment, that's going to have a big impact on government expenditure on Social Security through the age pension. At the moment, we don't spend very much on that. That won't be maintained, or can't be maintained into the future if those trends continue. And a much wider reason why the national level of government should take a much greater interest in this is that it has prime responsibility for national economic performance. And as myself, David, and other colleagues have been attempting to publicize or to reveal, the importance of the way that the housing system malfunctions, that the way that it underperforms, has an impact, damages economic performance, and that surely is a level of, or is an activity that the federal government has to consider, and as one of its key responsibilities.
Thanks, Al. I think I'll keep you on this topic and go to Kwan. I think what's interesting then from that point of view is seeing if Kwan's experience of looking more broadly across the Asia Pacific. Have you found then that national leadership is key as a contributing factor for generating affordable housing at scale, or are there other factors? Do you see what David and Al talked about resonating across the region?
Thanks. It is interesting to hear national policy making is a controversial issue in big countries like Canada, Australia. And I should go and read about Canada's new national housing strategy. I haven't. We could enhance housing affordability either by increasing the supply of low-cost housing, as I mentioned in the first answer, or increasing household ability to pay for housing through housing grants or rental vouchers. In either way, national leadership is definitely important, especially if we want to improve housing affordability at scale. Regarding the supply of affordable housing, although we could engage the private partners or nonprofit organizations, which we do a lot in the US or other Western countries, these projects tend to be quite small scale. This is because large scale provision of affordable housing requires huge land parcels and upfront development costs with the financing mechanisms for home buyers. For example, you may have heard about the success of public housing in Singapore, called the Housing and Development Board, HDB in short. More than 80% of Singaporean residents population reside in HDB. And this kind of large-scale supply of affordable housing would not have been possible without the national government commitment. In the first place, land acquisition is relatively easier in Singapore because the government owns 90% of the entire land. But the Housing and Development Board, this is the agency to develop this public housing, still has to pay the land and then development costs at the market rate. Also, all housing units are sold at significantly lower prices than the market rate, usually 1/3 of private condominium prices, and with a substantial housing grants for low-income households. Therefore, the Housing and Development Board, this agency, has continued to suffer a huge annual deficit, around $2 billion. The government has set aside about 2.4% of the budget to support this with a lot of government grants. Another story is in South Korea. Solving housing and affordability issues have been main political agenda for the central government for the recent years. To stabilize housing markets, the government has used very strict taxation measures, which did not really work out well, unfortunately. So it turned to the large-scale housing supply. The central government has appointed a Land and Housing Corporation, a quasi-public company, as a main developer, and this corporation has secured a large chunk of lands in the area that are very close to the city of Seoul and planned the third generation of new towns. Their goal is to provide 200,000 housing units at subsidized prices, and 80% of these units will be provided for households with special needs, such as the newly wedded couples, first-time home buyers, and households with many children. With these two cases, I would say that large-scale supply of affordable housing does need a national leadership and commitment. Of course, not all national governments are capable, or they may not be very willing to do this. But this is why we have a lack of affordable housing supply in a lot of other countries. That's what I think. Yeah.
Super, thanks, Kwan. I've got a couple of questions from the audience, so I'll jump to that before we sort of carry on that, but I think it ties well into this. I think I'm going to go to Hal first with sort of a question from Rachel about which tax settings do you think should be updated as a priority? So what change would affect the greatest change and for whom?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's a surprising amount of consensus, really, among the Australia's top economists on this topic. Those people who have comment on this. So it's not sort of I think the way that the system encourages overinvestment in housing, I think, is widely recognised, and we have to gradually find a way of moving away from that, I think. And I think that's also a matter of redirecting the huge support that the tax system actually gives to the housing system, to the housing market, redirecting it in a way that is much more equitable than it currently is. At the moment, it's highly the assistance that the tax system provides for the housing system is highly regressive. So we spend over $100 billion a year effectively in tax concessions that are predominantly to owner-occupiers, and that's a much more difficult political question, but at least 12 billion to private landlords. That is much more up for debate, I think. There's a lot of support for scaling that back. I'm talking about particularly about the discount on capital gains tax, the negative gearing of rental losses as well against your other income. Those are very controversial areas, and the way that the distribution of benefits from those tax concessions at the moment is highly regressive. So we need to scale those back. We need to redirect some of that support, in my opinion, it's not, Australia doesn't necessarily need to spend more on housing. It just need, in terms of government support, we just need to direct it in a more sensible way than we do at the moment. And some of the other the states and territories do have important tax powers here, which they could exercise in a better way for the housing system, especially by moving away from stamp duty and towards a broad-based land tax that we can see the way to go there, because the Australian Capital Territory, the ACT, has already started to do that, or is well advanced actually on a switch from those two, from one system to the other, which is revenue neutral. The New South Wales government has announced it intends to do the same, and that's but we don't know the detail of how it will do that yet. It will take quite some time to achieve, but that's something which I think a huge majority of economists in this area would say is pretty much a no-brainer.
Thanks, Al. I might go to Kwan first and then to David next, because I've also have a follow-up for David myself. And Kwan, from the audience, sorry, apologies. A question from Jesse, who's wondering, even if an effective housing strategy was implemented at a federal level, would it realistically be able to respond to the intricacies of each community as well as the centralized housing strategy?
I think it is a very valid question. This really depends on the context, I think. Singapore is a city-state, as you probably know, so it doesn't really have multiple layers of government. But on the other hand, most of countries have some tension between the central government and the localities. And then what I meant from my answer was that national level government should have the leadership and commitment. It doesn't have to design the detailed plan for housing supply in every single localities and every single city, right? It can have set the broad goal at the national level and sort of commit for money. That's the most important thing, because affordable housing supply requires a lot of money. And localities usually do not have enough money to be engaged in this huge scale of supply. That's why the national level government should have more sort of leadership, and then should have also have a more commitment. The other kind of thing that I want to comment on is that a lot of localities are more short-sighted, and then they tend to just listen to more influential sort of businessmen or other sort of people in their own cities. So, and there is a NIMBY, as we all know, not in my backyard. A lot of residents probably do not want to have affordable housing in their own backyard. So this kind of NIMBY and sort of other kind of lobbying and for these good areas in the city would sort of prohibit the affordable housing development in the good location in the city. That's why the national government has to chip in and sort of ensure the affordable housing can be supplied in a good location within a city, and then they should coordinate these kind of conflicts with the localities.
Brilliant, thanks, Kwan. I'm going to go to David then. I have a short and, pardon the pun, speculative question after you, and then a more in-depth one. And I guess the speculative one is when will the flow of cheap money end, or will it ever? And then I can pose to you the more in-depth one.
No, I saw that question and I never thought about it that way. But I don't see any end because of the income inequality and wealth inequality, and then the corruption in a bunch of nations, right? The oligarchs and this and that. There's just so much money out there. But also within Australia, within Canada, and in our big cities, right? There's some people doing really well. They don't know what to do with their money. And if you mean by low interest rates, well, yeah, that's another kind of question about when interest rates might change because of inflation and so on. And that's a toss-up. Nobody really knows, right? Yeah. See, but if I could get to the interesting question was asked about geographic diversity, right? Certainly Australia and Canada, very big countries. So we're about 38 million people in a big landmass with 10 provinces and 3 territories. So the provinces are like your states. And a lesson that is a positive one from our national housing strategy is that the federal government, I think as Kwan had referred to, that it was the national government bringing money to the table. Okay, now not a lot, but bringing some money to the table, and then telling every province, let's work out an agreement, but you're paying 50%. We're paying 50%, but you're paying 50%. And they worked that out with every province. And it's not all that easy, but when you bring 50% to the table, and you're bringing some other loans and other things to the table, and frankly, it's not a lot, as I said before, so they're not asking the provinces to do a lot because they're not doing a lot right now, but it is a beginning, and that's the way you do it. So there's a Canada-Ontario agreement, a Canada-Alberta agreement worked out with each province. That's the way you deal with that. And it is relatively simple if the national level brings money to the table, right? And that's a reason for having a national housing strategy and for having the nation involved. And I noticed the question, I'm not sure I have it right, but it's the role of housing in a country is infrastructure. We talk about hard infrastructure or social infrastructure, but housing, a nation that isn't housing its people well, and we know a bunch of poor countries doing that, they can't get on with proper economic development and proper prosperity and all that. And same with countries like the ones we're talking about right now, our country. So having people adequately housed at an affordable percentage of their income leaves them free to prosper and leaves their children free to prosper and contribute to the further development of the country. So this is why the national level must be involved. And we have probably a similar constitution. It doesn't say the federal government it doesn't say who's responsible for housing. People didn't worry about that in 1867 in our case. So you can easily finger point. But because of this fluke of the 2015 election, they weren't expecting to win. They made a bunch of big promises, so they did bring in a national housing strategy that is not very much, as I said, but it's a beginning, and it is re-engaging our national government in working with the provinces. That's the positive thing, and why I think Australia needs to fight for a national housing strategy, and why we need to fight for something more than, first little baby step, a nice document, but let's do better. Yeah.
I feel like Kwan wants to jump in first, and then I'll go to Hal. Kwan, do you have a reaction to this? And sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, I wanted to jump in for another question, not this one, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, good. Then let's go to Hal first, then, because I guess it ties into the question of the role of an underperforming housing system on whether it damages or not economic productivity. Do you want to take that one, Hal?
Yeah, thanks very much. I wanted to pick up here on a stream of work that that David and I have both worked on, that's also involved our colleague Duncan McLennan, and a series of reports that we've been working on issuing over the last 2 or 3 years around housing and productivity. And one of the sort of central message is that the housing system in Australia and to some extent in Canada, in many countries, is increasingly operating in a way that is, as I've claimed before, damaging economic productivity. And now, how can that occur? Well, one of the most obvious ways that it occurs is because housing is too expensive. Housing in Australia probably stands out as one of the most egregious examples of this. There are many surveys that highlight Australia, Canada, and New Zealand actually amongst the most expensive places with the most expensive housing in the world. And if you, as a country and as a collective of households who are spending more than you should be, more than an ideal amount on housing, then you've got less to spend on other things. And many of those other things would create more economic spin-off, more employment. They would create that housing is a relatively unproductive way to be sinking large amounts of money, which actually creates huge amounts of debt. So it's the crowding out of the possibility of expenditure on more economically productive activities, which is a really central part of this argument. A second aspect of it is the way that our cities are increasingly polarizing a lot of the middle and low income populations to the periphery, to places which are often very distant from centres of employment, and that has urban economic productivity consequences as well, negative ones, partly because of the costs, the collective cost of commuting and congestion, and also because that impairs the effective operation of labour markets. So the utilisation of the labour force, people of working age in the middle and outer suburbs, which are for a lot of people a long way from the kinds of employment that's suitable for them, makes it difficult for that resource to be properly utilised. So that undermines the effectiveness of the labour market. And the third one, which is a longer term one, but I think is also significant, is not just about it's a different aspect of this, which is not to do with over expensive housing or spatially dysfunctional housing, but is about the way that in Australia we have a very, very insecure rental system. We have a private rental system which gives pretty limited tenant security, and in a world where the private rental sector has been expanding, it's increasingly housing families as well as single people or households without children. And if you're in an insecure rental market, in an insecure tenancy, and there's a chance that you'll be having to move quite at a time of the landlord's choosing, not yours, that's a disruption for children's education, or it's certainly a risk that the next house you're able to find is too far from the current schools. So that is going to damage the educational attainment of an increasing part of the population, and there will be a long-term consequence of that. So that's the damage that it can do to human capital formation.
Thanks, Al. Kwan.
Yes, I want to jump in. Yes, I totally agree with Hal's all these explanations, but I want to add something that is more macroeconomic implications of housing affordability. So the cities exist because of agglomeration, economic agglomeration with the scale of economy, right? And this is why the big cities have higher productivity. Think about Silicon Valley, New York, Sydney, Melbourne. These cities are more higher productivity because they have a lot of population. Then these cities continue to want to see the population influx and healthy labor force. Otherwise, they cannot really continue to have a higher productivity, maintain higher productivity. Now, because of housing affordability is very serious in these cities, so this is kind of chicken and egg question. The cities are more productive, and the jobs are more available, and the salaries are higher. More people want to move to these cities. Housing becomes more expensive. Then supply is inelastic. So then people cannot move in. Then obviously the productivity cannot be maintained because we want to keep the labor force keep increasing in these high productivity cities. At the national level, U.S. government, federal government want to continue to see higher productivity in Silicon Valley, New York. In the Australian government, they want to see higher productivity continuing in Sydney and Melbourne. If these cities are so expensive and people go to other second-tier cities, it's a negative effect at the macro level, national level economy. So we have evidence in the US that these kind of housing affordability issues have hit very hard San Francisco, New York, and this has affected US GDP growth in a very significant way. Similarly in China, right? Beijing, Shanghai, too expensive. Young people go to other cities, and then these Beijing and Shanghai cannot maintain its high productivity. So I think that's just really sort of beyond the housing market, and it's really having a serious macroeconomic implications.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot for that, Kwan. I think I wholeheartedly agree with that. I'm going to go with one question that I have in the chat for David, but feel free, Hal and Kwan, to jump in on that. So it's a question, David, from Jessica, that underscores how in Australia the last election was seriously affected by the capital gains tax issue, and that there seems, in her view, an unwillingness to make these changes. So she's wondering, how do we move around this rather than saying they should do this or that, and we know it's a bit of a moot point. So I wonder if you have a comment on that.
The reference to the capital gains tax is what? I'm sorry, so I don't know the.
I wonder if actually Hal can help us unpacking that.
Yeah, certainly happy to do that. I mean, both 2016 and 2019 federal elections in Australia, housing was a major point of discussion, of contention, and one of the key aspects of that was a set of proposals that was put up by the opposition to scale back capital gains tax, definitely scale or capital gains tax concessions to investor landlords, and that was very definitely about scaling back. And I think from my own perspective and others that I work with, I'd say the most depressing aspect of the fact that that was part of the platform which was not elected is that the proposal was for a very, very modest sort of reform. It was for a very sensibly calibrated grandfathering and phased approach to beginning to rebalance those aspects of the tax system. So I think that is the only way to do it. I think more ought to. I mean, I think it wasn't well enough sold. I think the fact that it was actually a very gradual it was a very gradually phased implementation that was proposed, wasn't really clearly communicated. Some of the other aspects of tax changes that were proposed in the Labour platform, not to do with housing, were not going to be phased, were a once and for all change straight away. And I think that lost the opposition a lot more support than any proposed changes to housing tax settings. So I think it's a little bit of a myth, actually, to put a lot of the blame on the election result, or a lot of the interpreting the election result. I think it's a little bit of a myth to give too much influence to those housing tax proposals. I actually don't think they were the critical factor. They were an aspect. They were something that was controversial, and a lot of people were viscerally opposed to them. Yes, that's true. I think that I think Labour themselves know that they were not the crucial factor, because they have been jettisoned now, but it took them 2 years to decide to do that. They were thinking, well, maybe we could go with this again. Yeah, there were certain things that were jettisoned straight away after the 2019 election, a series of parts of the platform. That wasn't. It's actually only in the last 3 months or so that decision has been made. I mean, I think it's a mistake. I think I think it's regrettable. Not maybe that surprising, but I think the way that that was being proposed needs to be brought back, and I think it needs to be made clearer that it can be a form of hypothecation, really, that the savings that come out of that are redirected in a way that helps to stabilize the housing system. And that argument really wasn't made in selling the policy at the last election at all.
Thanks, Al. I wonder, David, then if I can bring you back in. Does that resonate with your experience in Canada?
It's too detailed here to get into that. Okay, we have some slightly different taxes and different debates.
Yeah, no problems. Kwan,
Yeah.
did you want to jump in on that? Otherwise, I'll take us next.
Comments. I have some evidence that this kind of a seller side taxation, which is a capital gains tax, doesn't work as good as well as the buyer side taxation. So in Singapore, we have both actually, but for the seller side taxation, we only have the short term taxation. So it's not the capital gains. It's just that if you own the housing only less than 3 years, then you have to pay the certain percentage of the sales price as a tax. The reason why I say this is because if we have a huge seller side taxation, it's going to freeze the market, and because sellers would not want to sell housing, and then that's going to reduce the number of transactions. With that, I think the buyer side taxation may work better.
Great, thanks, Juan. I'm going to go back to Hal for the next question first, and then circle to David. And I think sort of we take you a bit more in general on the question of who's best placed to deliver what. So the overall question here is what are the most effective current and potential housing intervention to address the housing affordability challenge? And I guess what we're particularly interested in at this stage is which actors are best placed to do what. If you can disentangle a bit more that for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I said earlier was really focusing on the national level of government. And without repeating that, I think perhaps we should think about what the states and territories can do as well, because there are certainly aspects of the system which are entirely under their control. And the most important one, I think, which could be most profitably or beneficially reformed, really at no cost to government, is the way that the private rental market is set up, or private rental regulation. Because in most of Australia, and Victoria is an honourable exception because there's been a recent reform package in Victoria, which has significantly rebalanced the sort of relation or the power relations between landlords and tenants. But in most of Australia, that hasn't happened. And I think a better deal for renters is something which we all ought to be advocating for. And I think Australia is a bit out of step. I think Canada certainly has, in most parts of Canada anyway, a more secure rental system from the tenant perspective. And I think the specific reform which would take us towards that in Australia would be to require that there's a specific ground for when a landlord wants to end a tenancy. You can do so on the basis of for a specific set of reasons which are set out in law, and not just because you feel like it or because you want to hold this over the head of the tenant to discourage them from complaining that you haven't done the repairs that you ought to be doing as a landlord. So I think all of those things are within the remit of state and territory governments, and that would also help slightly to reduce the desperate fear of missing out of entering home ownership, which is not only something which is desirable because it has so many financial benefits attached to it, but also because the status of being a renter is so poor.
Thanks, Al. David, can I take you on that?
Yeah. First off, okay, effective current housing intervention. Most of Western Europe and Northern Europe, their answer is to have a fairly significant social housing sector, nonprofit housing sector, and housing allowances or housing benefit. Because there's always a segment of any society that can't afford what the market has to offer. That's it. People, there's enough people, households, that don't generate what's called effective market demand, okay, for what the market is offering. So that's then a social need for housing, and that's what we're not doing. Remember when I said what a good housing system should do is produce enough supply, but produce choice, and then assist those unable to afford what is there. So in answering this question, I want to mention something very specific our federal government has done, and it did it before an election, so that okay, motive is something else, but it's not in the National Housing Strategy, and social housing is not in the National Housing Strategy, okay, but the situation for low-income people and the amount of homelessness in Canada is growing pretty significantly, and an election coming, so they put $1 billion on the table and called it the Rapid Housing Initiative, okay, and they said to provinces and municipalities, mainly municipalities with help from their provinces, you come to us with some good idea that's going to very quickly house people. So modular housing, during COVID, buy a hotel that the owners don't want any longer and can be made into supportive housing. And that worked out well. And they put, with another election coming, minority government, right? They put another $1.5 billion into it. So anyways, here's $2.5 billion in a 3-year period, roughly, that will produce 7,000 or 8,000 units of housing that will really help people who need it, homeless people and people who really need housing assistance, right? So there's always short-term things or long-term things that a government that means well can do. And then finally, who is in government does matter. We all know that. So a slightly social democratic government was elected in British Columbia, the New Democratic Party, 3 years ago. Well, they kept most of their promises, brought in a vacant unit tax, a speculation tax, foreign buyers tax, short-term rentals, Airbnb tax, address dishonesty in terms of money laundering and tax evasion and the ethics of real estate agents and so on. There's a list of things that they did that a state or province can do if they wanted to do something. And these are all modest steps, so they've not added up to a lot, but they began conservatively in doing new and different things, changing the rules of the game of the housing system.
Thanks, David. I'll go to Kwan, and then I've got a question for all of you from Kate.
Okay, I already talked about the Singapore's public housing, and besides this large-scale public housing supply, Singapore also tries to build up housing ladders between the public housing and then the private condominiums. I think this kind of housing ladder and segmentation is very important for the affordable housing supply. So there are households in Singapore who do not meet income eligibility, but cannot afford private condominiums. We call them sandwich class. So the government has introduced this new scheme called Executive Condominium, EC in short, to address the needs for this sandwich class. Because the sandwich class, they have a higher income, but condos are too expensive. This is actually not public housing, but it's actually public-private partnership in a sense. So when the government sells the land to the developers, it specifies that this is the site for the EC development, and developers usually bid with a lower price for the land. As a result, the developer can offer the lower sales price for these used EC units compared to the private condominium units. And I did some research on this and I found the price difference is between 15 to 18% at the initial stage of selling. Of course, there is income eligibility conditions for these ECs as well. Currently, it's a monthly household income of $16,000. So it's actually not very low, $16,000 a month. Whereas the income eligibility for the public housing HDB is $14,000. So it's a $2,000 difference. And both public housing and ECs have a minimum occupancy period of 5 years before they can sell it to the market. Actually, it prevents the short-term flippers or short-term speculators, right? So to me, this EC is very sustainable model because the government does not have to put a lot of upfront costs and they can segment the markets. There is a public housing for the middle class and a little bit upper sandwich class, there is this EC, and then for very wealthy households, there is a private condominiums. So this kind of segmentation, I think, works very well in Singapore, and then can lead to housing mobility for households within this ladder. And besides these kind of things, Singapore government also looked into the possibility to convert some office buildings in the CBD because there is a lower demand now after the COVID-19. People work from homes. So how to convert these office buildings to the residential areas, and then we can have a more mixed-use development in the CBD area. In South Korea, also, they try to convert some less popular hotels to housing for single households. They also do a lot about share housing in Korea and Japan. So, this share housing, the single households, they live together and share these common facilities, but then they have their separate rooms. And this is actually very good for social, viable social sort of integrity and harmony for society. So I think these are some sort of examples that I found interesting from the Asian Pacific research.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up to that, Kwan, that we've got from the audience before I sort of jump to David and Hal. And I guess the question there, is paraphrasing slightly, but is do you think that the notion of Singapore's HDB system and the leasing system itself, is that transferable to the private sector? How would that work, or is that just simply not viable?
That's a very tough question. Singapore is a very unique context. As I mentioned, it's a city-state. The government is very much committed to public housing supply. Although we have experienced a much deficit, we still do this. So not sure how this can work with the private housing sector. I mean, private housing sector definitely needs incentives for affordable housing supply. They cannot do it like, for a goodwill, because they are the profit-making entity, right? So we need to provide some incentives, for example, tax incentives or like a land. We can, like the executive condominiums that I introduced just now. This is that the government can offer the lower land price for the private developers, so they can actually secure land at a lower cost, and that's how they can actually provide the lower price housing than the private condominiums. So if the government can secure the large chunk of land in good locations, they can perhaps work with a private partner, but then there should be a condition that this site should be the affordable housing development. Then the land subsidies or the a little bit lower land cost can be an incentive for the developer to be engaged in this kind of affordable housing supply. And other than that, some tax incentives, right? I think we already have this in the probably in Australia as well, tax credit. If they engage in affordable housing development, we can give some sort of tax incentive, and these tax credits can be sold in the market. And I'm not sure how that really works in Australia, but in the US, and this kind of a low-income housing tax credit works pretty well, because obviously US government has kind of gone off from the public housing development, so they really rely on this low-income housing tax credit program for the last several decades, and it worked, I think, okay, not like perfectly. So that's what I can think of right now. Yeah.
Thanks for taking a tough one, Kwan. Much appreciated. David, I'll come to you and then on to Hal on what might be another tough one. So Kate, our Kate Rayner is asking, how do you balance the competing policy goals of increasing housing affordability while protecting or even increasing the wealth and equity of existing homeowners? Is that even possible? What do you think?
Well, the answer is easy. You make a choice. If you think housing is about increasing wealth and equity for some people, right? Well, that's our housing system, in fact, Canada's and probably Australia's, right? You can't have it both ways. And a big impediment to making progress on housing everyone properly in our countries is this very fact, right? That there's a vested interest by a majority, right? The majority are homeowners. And they don't want to see their asset go down. And there was a great interview too. The deputy housing minister a year and a half ago was being interviewed, and the question was, house prices went up 15 or 20% this year, and something should be done. The interviewer said, and then this cabinet minister said, well, no. He's watching out for homeowner equity, right? So you leave somebody behind. So that's why I said, what kind of housing system do you want, right? Those three criteria I mentioned, and increasing wealth and equity for some people is not there. And if it's there, you're on purpose doing the opposite to other people. And Hal spoke to that about the lack of a 10-year security and let alone affordability among renters. So we in Canada at least have ongoing tendencies. You rent someplace, you're a good tenant, you just live there. You can't be kicked out. You can be evicted for, bad things, but otherwise you live there. Okay. No, so make a choice.
Thanks, David. How?
I mean, I have to agree with David that it is a bit of a zero-sum game here. I think it is partly about it. It is a choice, but it's about how you balance those two competing, objectives. Those two things which are they're in tension with each other, and we have got a particular balance in Australia, and which is a pretty similar one in Canada as well at the moment. And it's a balance which is weighted in one direction pretty heavily, as David said. So there are choices about adjusting that, which are not not out of the not sort of politically completely unthinkable. But I mean, I do think that also the way that governments could choose to avoid that choice, but still do some good in this area, is by mass social housing. A mass social housing program is something that you can do and avoid this contentious and area where political leadership and risk is unavoidable. If you are going to tackle those issues, if you are going to seriously try to rebalance the interests of wealth accumulation for existing homeowners versus housing affordability for people who are at the other end of the market, if you want to avoid that, well, but you still do some good, you could by deciding to invest big in a social housing program, and that isn't only going to benefit the people that benefit directly because they're the new tenants of the expanded sector, but also if you expand the social housing system significantly, then that's going to have a beneficial effect on the lower end of the private rental market as well, because it's going to create competition. It's going to create some relief, or it could, in theory, create some relief for unaffordable rents at the bottom end of the private rental market, even for people that don't have the benefit of actually having a social housing tenancy. So it can have that benefit, and for the system as a whole, it also has a potential benefit because it creates a more diverse housing system overall, one that's more resilient, one that's not so vulnerable to cyclical fluctuation, to volatility. That's a benefit that countries that have larger non-market housing sectors have over countries like Canada and Australia, which are highly vulnerable to volatility that is partly a product of the structure of their system.
Thanks, Al. I have to jump in with one last question. It's unavoidable that I have to ask you a COVID question, but if okay for everyone, just asking a quick soundbite reply. I know I'm asking a giant question in a 1 minute response, but I guess what we were interested in was talking about national housing or just in general housing policy not just in the wake of COVID-19, but the climate crisis, widening urban inequalities. I guess our question is, what are the implications of delivering housing policy in a time of deep crisis, in the wake of a deep crisis? And I wonder if I can go first to Kwan, then to David, and wrap up with Hal.
Yeah, the current crisis, such as a pandemic and also widening inequality, brought even more challenges of housing and affordability. And the national housing policy measures are urgently needed, I think. We have seen many job losses and reduction in household income in the labor market during this time. Some households have been evicted or foreclosed upon. The only option for them to would live in less adequate or overcrowded housing, which would have a strong correlation with the virus infection. Hence, expanding affordable housing becomes urgent not only for housing needs, but also for the public health reasons. In the long term, we may see fundamental labor market restructuring, and this will play an important role to housing markets. Many people talk about the potential scenario that the remote working becomes a new normal, and firms do not have to be in CBD in big cities anymore, while some forecast the potential mix of in-office and home working. In either scenario, some jobs would need more personal interactions, and these are more likely to be low-skill jobs. They need to be located closer to higher density areas where housing demand is higher and housing unaffordability is more severe. Without the proper policy intervention, these households will face enormous hardships. And we have to also think about how to make our cities more resilient economically, socially, and environmentally in the post-pandemic era. I already talked about the productivity kind of things, the macroeconomic implication of housing affordability. So the Australian government would want to see continuing economic success in Sydney and Melbourne, unless we offer affordable housing in these cities. It will be very difficult to continue to have influx of young people. And the other kind of thing is that young folks probably would give up marriage or having a kid because they have to spend too much money on housing. This actually happens in a lot of developed countries already. And definitely this will have a negative impact on labor force. And at the national level, again, this foregone productivity and GDP growth should be very significant. If we do not account for housing needs for the homeless, I think David mentioned this in Canada, although we don't have any homeless in Singapore, but homeless or the low-income people, then this will be they will be very unhappy, and which may lead to social instability. Right? If the national government does not intervene in housing supply in popular urban centers, to meet housing demand, the developers may turn to suburban location, leading to urban sprawl. I think that's what Hart mentioned before, right? This also brings negative impact on environment. So to sum up, I think it is time for the national government to step in and address the housing challenges before it becomes too late.
Thanks, Kwan. David.
Thanks. Yes. Okay. A crisis is an opportunity for innovation, right? We throw that word around, so I always want to define it 3 words: substantive, positive change, right? But for a crisis to produce substantive, positive change, it's got to harm a lot of people, and it's got to harm some powerful and wealthy people, frankly. So have we seen a lot of change of the global financial crisis, and who's being harmed in COVID right now, sadly, right? People in poor quality housing, overcrowded housing, and all that, right? But it's an opportunity. And I'll just close by referring back to the good question that Kate Rayner raised about homeowners' equity. And I want to reiterate Hal's answer there about balance, right? So in a crisis can be, and this COVID crisis should be, an opportunity to introduce some of this balance. So you don't have to take things away from homeowners, although there's improvements to be made there since the benefits are so good. But to help out people who don't have an opportunity to ever be a homeowner and all that, right? To complete the housing system, as Hal has mentioned.
Much appreciated. Hal, you're the last word.
Yeah, completely endorse everything that David said there. And I mean, Australia's experience of responding to the pandemic in terms of its housing and housing-related responses, in terms of emergency responses, was pretty good, actually. Australia didn't do badly in that area. But yeah, as David said, what's the prospect of systemic change as a result of that? Almost, it's really hard to see it. Very sorry to say, and maybe because it wasn't a serious enough crisis for the parts of society that really emerged from it very, very much unscathed.
Brilliant. I'm about to hand back over to our Master of Ceremonies, so I'm just going to throw a very informal thank you to Hal, David, and Kwan for doing this from different parts of the globe, even around the corner, or far on the exact other side of the globe. A ton of great stuff in there. I've scribbled a million notes, and we've got a great note taker anyway that has done this visually better than I could. So big thanks to the three of you, and I'm handing back to Karen now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michele and Hal and Kwan and David. That was a really amazing conversation. I've been tweeting madly all of the ideas that you've been putting forward there. So thanks for a terrific discussion. There were also some really fabulous questions put there. And I think we can all agree that Zara's graphic illustration was really terrific as well. It's incredible how quickly she can just capture the conversation. So really, really fabulous. We are now going to take a 45-minute break for lunch before resuming for our next panel conversation, and that's on housing regulation for disability housing. So grab yourselves some lunch and we will see you back here at 1 o'clock.